this country to other countries, but certainly you must agree that many of your close allies, very close allies, mistreat journalists, put them in prison, persecute them and so on. And, you seem to maybe issue a statement. I mean, I don't want to name countries, but you probably know what I'm talking about. You seem to issue a statement and stops there. So, you hold like foreign journalists in a different standard.
I disagree with that, because much of what we do, you know this, Saeed, all of you know this, much of what we do is behind the scenes. And some people may think, oh, the State Department isn't doing enough on this case or that case. I'd encourage you to go back and talk to your editors, because we've helped some of your very own colleagues. We won't speak about it. We'll be discreet about it, but we continue to do that, and we're proud of our work. That's what we do on behalf of American citizens and journalists who in some instances are not American citizens.
I just want to say one thing.
Go ahead, Gardner.
Countries around the world, these dictators are use fake news as a rallying cry for oppression of journalists, directly echoing the President of the United States.
But you know
that
what?
does not cause you any concern?
You know what? Since having taken this job, and I'm a former journalist myself, I have been disheartened, and I didn't believe it until I got into this role and started working with reporters each and every day. You all are a great group. You know that. I respect to the nth degree what you do for a living. And I think we always have fair and honest exchanges of ideas, our concepts, our values, our policies. I have seen since taking on this role inaccurate and sloppy reporting. Sometimes I think it's intentional because of bias. Other times it may just be someone's naivete. And so when the president has spoken about fake news, when other world leaders have spoken about fake news, there is such a thing. We have experienced that just this week. One news magazine, for example, taking the secretary's quote about Iran and twisting that quote and making it inaccurate. That information was used by the Iranian regime, for example, and I can give you all the details, for its own propaganda purposes. So fake news, I hate to say, but is a real thing. It is a real thing, Gardner. I'm sure you've seen it. Others have. You all have had to make corrections at many of your publications, yours included, in the past for inaccurate and sometimes biased reporting.
I didn't want to get. This isn't about us, but you mentioned that. So, do you think then that anyone that you accuse of fake news is an enemy of the people? Is that the position of the State Department as well?
Matt, I don't think that news reporters are the enemy of the people. What I do think, what I do think is very dangerous is when the news is dishonest. When you report, not you, but when journalists report false information, and I've seen it come from the highest levels of news organizations where I've had to pick up the phone and call the president of unnamed news organizations who have been unwilling to change their headlines or to change their stories despite facts to the contrary. That has to stop. And when I spoke to these women yesterday to hear their stories about what they do each and every day, they are the best of what journalists should all aspire to do. And I hope we can all keep that in perspective, fact-based reporting. And I think that's why the president and others in this country and other countries around the world become very concerned when reporting is taken out of context, is inaccurate, or is biased.
But you don't agree with the idea that someone who does that, whether intentional or not, is an enemy of the people?
I'm not going to get into this.
Right,
I think we've
good.
addressed it enough. If you'd
Good.
like to make this entire briefing about the profession of the news business, we could do it, or we could take it over to the museum and have a conversation.
Can I ask you about the sanctions that were imposed on the 17 Saudi officials
Yes, you
today?
may.
So the reaction to this from various members of the Hill, members of Congress, has been, well, okay, this is a good first step, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. And I realize that the Secretary in his statement said, we're going to continue to uncover the facts, and as we do, we'll act appropriately. But can you say, are you able to say now that this is not the end, that there will be something more substantive? I don't want to say these are substantive, but something more that will come as the case against these people and perhaps others in the future continue?
We rarely preview sanctions or other activities. You all are well aware of that. The Secretary has addressed this in a general sense and has said that this is not the last that you have heard from the U.S. government on this very issue, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Today, in conjunction with the Department of the Treasury, we put out a statement, as did Treasury, imposing sanctions on 17 Saudi Arabian individuals for serious human rights abuses resulting from their roles in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi at the consulate of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul, Turkey on October the 2nd. That action was taken under the authority of Executive Order 13818, which implements and builds upon the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. As a result of that action, all of the individuals' assets within U.S. jurisdiction are blocked. U.S. persons are generally prohibited from engaging in transactions with these individuals. At the time of Jamal Khashoggi's killing, these individuals occupied positions in the royal court and at several ministries and offices of the government of Saudi Arabia. The United States government goes on to list the names of those sanctioned individuals. If someone has not received this notice, you can certainly contact our press office for this, or the Treasury press office. Global Magnitsky Act empowers the United States to take significant steps to protect and promote human rights and combat corruption around the world. Our action today is an important step in responding to Jamal Khashoggi's killing. The State Department will continue to seek all relevant facts. We will continue to consult Congress and work with other nations to hold accountable those who were involved in his killing. Yeah.
But can you say that you are satisfied that in terms of the seniority of officials, that it stops where it stops, or is it still an open question? It could still, those to be punished could, or to be sanctioned, it could be higher level than what has already happened.
So let me respond to your question this way, because the Saudi government made an announcement today. We regard the announcement that they made as a good first step. It's a step in the right direction. It is an initial investigation finding. It is important that those steps continue to be taken toward full accountability. We will continue to work diligently to ascertain the facts. The Secretary has talked about the importance of gathering data from various sources. That's something that the U.S. government continues to do. That data will then help inform the decisions that we end up making and taking in the future, and that's in part how we arrived in conjunction with Treasury at the global Magnitsky sanctions of those Saudi individuals. Okay. Okay. Michelle, go right ahead. Hi.
Are you satisfied with the findings? The Saudi prosecutor.
Well, that's why I say that this is an important first step, and that this is also an initial finding of its investigation. We expect that the investigation will continue, not only in Saudi Arabia, but in Turkey as well, as we continue to develop facts, a fact set, and make determinations from here on out. Okay? Sorry, Jen, go right ahead.
Wait. Let me stick with this just for a second.
Okay, go ahead, Gardner.
Sorry. So this explanation today seems to contradict earlier explanations by the Saudis. Today they seem to be saying that this was a rendition gone bad before they agreed that it actually was a premeditated murder. The administration even seemed to agree with that earlier premeditated murder explanation. Where are you on is this a rendition gone bad? Was this a premeditated murder? And can you tell us whether...
I think it's still too early for us to be able to answer that question. We continue to get the information, and we'll analyze and make determinations as we get additional information.
And the announcement today about the sanctions, was that at all coordinated with the Saudis? These two announcements came today within an hour of each other, one from Saudi Arabia about its conclusions, the other from the United States about its sanctions.
Sure.
Was the timing a coincidence?
It was not. It has been no secret. Even though we don't forecast sanctions, it has been no secret because many of you have emailed me all hours of the day asking me when these sanctions would be announced. So the U.S. government and some officials have spoken to this, so it's no surprise that something of this sort was coming out and would be announced today.
You explained repeatedly in the past that sanctions take weeks, months, and even years. In fact,
it depends on the level of complexity. And I'm not a sanctions expert, so I'm not going to try to be one. But in having talked to a lot of my colleagues who are more technical experts on this matter, for example, when we talk about CATSA, a very different kind of instrument of sanctions. That type of sanction can take a very long time to dig down into all of the details because they can involve very complex, large conglomerates, businesses overseas. Today, Treasury and the State Department announced individuals individuals, unless they're maybe an oligarch, can be a little bit easier to drill down onto the facts of their portfolios, their holdings, and all of that. So that is why that may not take as long as when we deal with something like CATSA.
And one other thing in a related matter, NBC News reported today that the administration was actually thinking about some sort of getting Fethullah Gulen to the Turks in some way, even though this administration has yet to even start any kind of judicial extradition process. Can you?
Yeah. So
help
let's
us
back
understand
up
that?
a little bit, because over the past year and a half since I've been in this role, we've talked a fair bit about the Turks' interest in Fethullah Gulen, who's in the United States. We have received multiple requests from the Turkish government, at least over the time that I've been here, related to Mr. Gulen. We continue to evaluate the materials that the Turkish government presents, requesting his extradition. This is wholly handled out of the Department of Justice, so I'd have to refer you to the Department of Justice for information on that. But I can tell you these issues are unrelated. I've seen some news reports where people are trying to conflate the two. Saudi Arabia and Turkey with Khashoggi and Gulen, and there is no relation. So let's pull those two issues apart and keep them discrete just as they are. Let me also add, because I've spoken to some of my White House colleagues about this, the White House has not been involved in any discussions related to the extradition of Fethullah Gulen. Okay. Michelle, I'll come back to you.
Discussions with the Turks or interagency discussions?
With the Turks. Extradition, yeah, with the Turks. Yeah. Okay, yeah, go right ahead.
Thank you very much. On the Palestinian issue today, Mark,
Michelle, I'll come back to you. Let me just try to get around the room a little bit.
30 years ago, the Palestinians recognized Israel and its right to exist and as a state. But they have been waiting for Israel to recognize a Palestinian entity of some sort for the past 30 years. And, meanwhile, the occupation goes on, the settlements go on, the arrests go on, and so on. Don't you think that the time has come for Palestinian self-determination and statehood?
I think the time has come for peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We have a team that's very hard at work trying to get the two sides together. When we talk about a two-state solution, Saeed, we need both parties to sit down and have direct negotiations to do that. You can't do this through an intermediary. You can't do this through headlines and fights in the press related to that. You have to sit down and you have to be willing to compromise. The president has repeatedly said, and we've repeatedly said, that two sides are probably going to have to give a bit to develop a lasting peace. We hope we hope that we can get to this point. We've got a deal that is still in the works, and when we're ready to announce that deal and unveil that deal, I'll be thrilled to bring it to you.
On this very point, today Mr. Jason Greenblatt actually published an op-ed or an opinion piece in my own newspaper, and he talks at length about the need to normalize with the Arab countries and so on, but he hardly talks about, whatever points the plan might have and so on. He's not reaching out to the Palestinians. I suggest that you read the whole article. It's a lengthy.
Yeah,
very thorough.
I've taken a look at Jason Greenblatt's editorial. I think it was posted in your paper, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm glad that you ran that. Look, our relationship with Israel is not simply about a peace plan. Israel's relationship with many other countries around the world is extremely broad. They do a lot of great work in the areas of finance, manufacturing, desalination of water. There are a lot of things. It is a broad relationship that they have with a lot of countries. Commerce is in part what Jason Greenblatt addressed in his editorial, and there's nothing wrong with discussing those issues and not simply every time he writes to talk about Israeli-Palestinian peace, as important as that issue is. So he has other work to do, and that's part of it as well.
He's charged with that. He's charged with that. And I'm just asking whether you have shifted the fulcrum or the center of your emphasis or your focus.
He knows these issues. He knows the country very well, and I'm glad to see him put pen to paper and share his expertise with others. And by the way, Saeed, I know he'll be thrilled that you read it, so I'll be sure to let him know.
Last week, the Israelis arrested 45 Americans that were, planting flowers and so on, and they released them. I wanted to ask you whether you had anything to do with their release so quickly. They were released right after 2 hours and so on, or are you aware of the situation?
Yeah, that's one of the situations where there are privacy considerations, so I just can't comment on that due to that, okay? Hi, Lori.
Hi. Earlier this month, you tweeted that one of the 12 conditions for lifting sanctions on Iran is that the regime, quote, must respect the sovereignty of the Iraqi government and permit the disarming, demobilization, and reintegration of Shia militias, end quote. Is that still your position?
Nothing has changed with regard to our position on that.
Even though Iraqi politicians have said you're interfering in Iraq's internal affairs?
You know, I don't think we're interfering in Iraq's internal affairs. That's something we take great pains to not do that. We respect the sovereignty of the Iraqi government. Sovereignty is an important element of what this U.S. administration stands for. You can read that in our national security strategy. We have a great relationship with the Iraqi people, but we believe that Iraq is a sovereign nation.
And on Syria's Kurds, last month, Secretary Pompeo said they were, quote, great partners and will ensure them, quote, a seat at the table. Is that still your position?
Our position has not changed. Kurds are great partners, and you remember the president up at UNGA, I think you were in the audience there, where he called upon one of, he's not here today, is he? Mr. Kurd, the bureau chief. And we were thrilled that he then put an article in the Wall Street Journal. So our position has not changed.
Mr. Kurd appreciates that a lot, and he thanks the president.
Invite Mr. Kurd back, please. We enjoy him. Hey, Laura. I'm sorry, Janny.
Thank you very much, Heather. Two questions, quick. On North Korea, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un recently announced that North Korea will rebuild both the nuclear and economy. In this regard, we don't know whether North Korea denuclearized. What do you think about North Koreans' brinkmanship diplomacy? Second questions.
I think a lot of these things are negotiating points, and a lot of these are positions that various governments, just as a general matter, will use leading up to negotiations. This is an issue, the denuclearization of North Korea, that President Trump has been intimately involved in. The Secretary, of course, is his personal representative on that, Steve Biegun as well, and they've been hard at work working toward the denuclearization of North Korea. We've said this before, we have a long way to